Do we have any history professors here? Phew, good. Okay, do we have any armchair historians? Anybody that just likes history, watch the History Channel? We've got one. I know we've got another. We've got three. We've got, okay, some reluctant historians. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you too many hard questions. Just a couple more. Does anybody here, do we remember when the plague, the bubonic plague, swept across Europe? Anybody want to guess at the century? 14th. So middle of the 1300s, 1346 through about 1349, somewhere in there, 1350 actually. Who knows how that plague was spread? Rats who carried fleas, who carried bacteria. It was just a bacterial infection, but for folks who did not have antibiotics, they had no understanding of germs and viruses that were so tiny that we could not see them with the naked eye. They had no idea what was happening. From what I understand, there were several merchant ships that left Asia and traveled to Italy, and when they landed or docked at the port, many of the sailors were sick. And when they unloaded the cargo, all the rats that like to travel by ship also came off the ships, and they had fleas that carried this bacteria, and it spread like wildfire, and no one knew how to stop it. Now, one thing that I did not know about the plague until I looked it up this week was that in the years 1348 and 49 in particular, there were groups of Christians, European Christians, who believed that God sent the plague as a punishment for sin. And so, in order to make things right for this angry God, they decided that the Jews must be to blame. Now, according to historian Albert Winkler from Brigham Young University, there were 300 communities all across Europe where mobs of Christians persecuted their Jewish neighbors, killed them, and ran those who survived out of town. They were trying to make a sacrifice to an angry God. And we can understand where they might have gotten that idea because it sounds a little bit like our reading this morning that comes straight out of the book of Numbers. Now, we call it the book of Numbers, but the Jewish people call it in the wilderness. If you look at chapter 1, verse 1, that phrase is there, in the wilderness, and it describes how the people came to be wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Moses had brought the people out of Egypt. They had crossed the Red Sea. They had gone across the land. They were right at the edge of the promised land. They were ready to step into it. They sent 12 spies. Do you remember the story about the spies? The spies went into Canaan. They looked it over. They came back after 40 days. And 11 of them said, it's a good land. There's a lot of produce there, but there's also a lot of people there. And the people are strong, and some of them are giant. So we should not go in there. One spy, Caleb, came back and said, yes, that's all true, but we should do it. God did not bring us this far for us to stop now. We've got so much invested into this. We can do it with God's help. Let's go into the land. Then fake news got a hold of the reports and put a different spin on it. And what the people heard was, that land is terrible and it will devour us. We will lose our identity, we'll lose our communities, we'll lose our sense of self, we might lose our lives. We're going to lose everything if we go across that border. And of course, the people believed that report. They turned on Moses and they said, you have brought us to a dead end. We are done with you. We are going back to Egypt. Now remember, Egypt is a place of slavery and a place of death, but it is also what they know. And so they are willing to turn back and go to Egypt. Now God, meanwhile, is listening to all of this, and God is angry. Do you remember few weeks ago, we talked about the body of God and how Francesca Stavrakopoulou argues pretty convincingly that these ancient Near East people viewed God as someone who has a physical body. Well, this God has a nose, And according to Dr. Francesca, the nose is where anger is stored. So have you ever heard someone say, his nose is out of joint? Huh? It means he's mad and you want to stay out of his way. Well, God's nose is out of joint. And God says to Moses and Aaron, get away from these people. I've had it. I'm wiping them out with a plague, and they are all going to be gone. But Moses talks God out of it. Moses says, wait a minute, God, you don't want to do that, or the Egyptians are going to laugh at everybody. They're going to laugh at you because you could not control this people. So don't kill them. Give us another chance. So God relents. God forgives. And God hands down a consequence. For every day that those spies were in the promised land, 40, the Israelites will wander for 1 year in the desert, 40 years, until every last one of those who refused to go into the promised land was dead. But the next generation could go in. And that, I think, is what kept Moses going. Moses always had this view of the promised land. He knew it was going to be a place of safety and abundance for the people. And even if Moses couldn't get in, because he also would die in the desert, he knew the next generation could. And he's willing to let go of all his own hopes and dreams so that next generation would have that place of safety and abundance. Now, the people, of course, are crushed when they find out they are not going to get into the promised land ever, and they're not even going to go back to Egypt. They are going to wander like nomads for 40 years and be homeless. Of course they're upset, wouldn't you be? But out of that discontent, rebellions pop up. According to Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, there are actually 2 rebellions that happen in the same chapter as our reading today. One is Korah's rebellion, which is against Moses. Korah accuses Moses of only wanting power, when if you read the Torah, you know that Moses has never wanted power, not from day one when he tried to get out of the calling that God placed on his life. For Moses, it's always about getting to this place of safety and abundance, where people can worship the way they want. But Korah doesn't understand that. Korah has a wrong assumption. And he leads a rebellion. He gathers as many people to his side as he can. And there are also, at the same time, another 250 individuals who are rebelling against Aaron. Aaron is Moses' brother. He's the high priest. And they're saying, Aaron's only the high priest because he's Moses' brother. If he wasn't Moses' brother, he wouldn't be the high priest. We are just as qualified to be the high priest as Aaron. And so these 250 individuals, I'm sure male, take censers or fire pans, and they put embers in them, and they put incense on the embers, and they are waving them so this incense offering goes up to God. It's supposed to make God happy. The smell of the incense is supposed to remove the anger from God's nose. But it backfires on both of those rebellions. Korah and his whole community, men, women, children, animals, tents, everybody that was with him, is swallowed by this huge sinkhole. Has anybody ever seen a sinkhole? Because I have seen 2 near where I live that tried to swallow tractors. It makes you think twice about taking a walk in the field. It's terrifying. The Israelites are watching as Korah and all of his household and all of his friends and all of their households sink into the ground, and they are gone. But it's not done yet. God is still angry. Next, we see those 250 wannabe priests with their censers, their fire pans, giving off this incense before God, and flames come out of those fire pans and burn up the 250 people. This sounds like a horror movie. Can you imagine? And when that's all done, the dust has settled from the sinkhole. The remnants of the 250 are still smoldering, and the people turn on Moses. And they say, you did this. You killed God's people. And that is what Pastor Jake read for us this morning. They turn on Moses and they blame him, because we are always looking for somebody to blame when things are going wrong. Now, God is even more angry than before. His nose is fully out of joint at this point. He is on his last nerve, and this last thing that the people said to Moses has put him over the edge. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been maybe in a workplace or a relationship or a church or anywhere else where somebody has finally done the last thing and you're finished? You are out of here and you are not coming back. That's where God is. God is very human here, very angry, very upset, and has had it. He's done. And so God sends a plague, and God tells Moses and Aaron, move away from these people. I'm done. This is going to happen. They're all going to die. And they watch in horror, I'm sure, as the plague begins to sweep across the congregation. Now, Moses knows that God is so mad, he's so far gone, that no talking or prayer is going to do it. Nothing is going to stop this. So he says to Aaron, quick, go get your censer. You're the high priest, Aaron, right? Get your censer, put the coals in it, put the incense on it, and you run out there into the crowd. Now let's hang out with Aaron for just a minute here. Aaron has just seen 250 people burned up by the very same fire pan that Moses is telling him to pick up. And if we went back in time to Leviticus chapter 10, we would find out that Aaron had 2 adult sons who also used those same fire pans, those censers, and burned incense to God, and the same thing happened to them. They were burned up. Aaron has seen his own family and 250 other people injured by this censer, and now Moses is telling him to get one and put the incense in it and run out there in the middle of the crowd. Now, what can happen to Aaron here? Either the fire comes out of the censer and burns him up, which it seems to be wanting to do lately, or the plague is going to take him out, because God told them, get out of the congregation so that you don't fall in the plague. Or there's a third option. And the third option is that the little wisp of smoke will get up into God's nose and God will stop. And that's what happens. Aaron does what Moses asks him to do. He rushes into the middle of this congregation. People are dying before him. He holds up his censer. This little wisp of smoke goes up to God, and the plague stops. And Aaron is left in this dramatic ending where he is standing literally between the dead and the living. Everyone in front of him has fallen. Everyone behind him is still alive. It's almost as good as Indiana Jones. Maybe The Mummy. And we think that those movies are so interesting and fun. The Bible has these stories in it. And I'm sure they were spellbinding stories for the people that told them around campfires and on the road. Now, what did it take for Aaron to do what Moses asked him to do? What did he have to give up to be able to run into a plague with nothing more than a smoking ashtray and face off the angel of death? I think Aaron had to let go of his own life, to lay down his life for his friends. The only thing he was hoping was that he could stop the plague and save the lives of some of the Israelites. Because who's going to enter into that promised land if they're all gone? He had to let go of everything he held dear. And you can be sure he did it afraid. I mean, if it was me, I don't know if I could do it. Could you? Could you do what Aaron did that day? Now, in this story, God does not look great. God looks like a mean, vindictive, punishing kind of God who lets his emotions run amok And you never know when God might decide that you are toast. It's not a good look for God. But for people who did not understand plague and germs and bacteria and viruses, this made sense, that we must have done something. And that's why God has sent this plague. And whatever it is, we've got to fix it. But now that we understand how plagues begin and how to treat them, we let go of that view of God. I really struggled with this story this week because I don't like God in this story. God is a mean guy. And it's just not the love and mercy and grace that I like to talk about. But this made sense to people. They were still hanging on to the idea that God would punish them if they did wrong. And this is the same idea that those European Christians had when they persecuted their Jewish neighbors and blamed them for the bubonic plague. They wanted to blame someone because when God is angry, nobody is safe. So we've got to do everything we can to make it right. We let go of that kind of thinking. Aaron let go of his own life to stand in the gap so that that would stop. And maybe that's what this church is called to do, to stand in the gap between the living and the dead. Now, as we think about these stories of the plague and how it was spread in the 1300s, and this story about the plague and how it was spread and stopped, let's think about what people carried into the community. Starting with those ships, right? Ships come to port. Sailors spread disease. They are carrying the bacteria on their bodies. Cargo is carrying rats. Rats are carrying fleas. Fleas are carrying bacteria, right? All these things are being carried into the community by someone who doesn't know or doesn't notice or doesn't think it's bad. In our story today, the 11 spies, they bring doubt, don't they, to their community. Korah brings a wrong assumption about Moses, and fake news brings misinformation, and all those things affect the community. So what is it that we all have brought into this place today? What have we brought into our relationships? What have we brought into our families and into our homes? What unseen little critters have followed you in here today? What bad attitudes? What hurtful words? What hurt feelings? What old wounds? What emotional baggage has come with each and every one of us into this place? We want to be so careful about what we bring to the community because it is catchy. And I have been the worst. If you're here on a Tuesday morning, that's my gripe time. Carl and Evelyn will tell you that's true. So as we're trying to be careful about what we bring into the community, we need to also understand that those are all things we can let go of. We can let go of bad attitudes. We can let go of some of our wounds and our trauma. We can look for healing, but as long as we're holding on to a wound or a hurt or a story someone said, we cannot open our hands to receive what God has for us. And what God has for us is a promised land. Now, I don't know what you think of when you imagine what would the promised land look like for all of us, but I know I have a picture. I have a picture in my head of one church that is unified, relevant, worshiping, singing together, mission-driven, contemporary. A one church where all of our labels and our traditions are celebrated, but they are secondary. The name United Church of Christ and the name Presbyterian, we honor, but they don't hold us back. Because if we hang on to those identities, we can never open our hands long enough to receive from God what God might have for us. And God is calling us all to let go of something. It might feel like it's something good. The Israelites wanted to go back to Egypt because they knew Egypt. It made sense to them. They were comforted by it even though it meant enslavement. So what is it that we need to let go of today? We met with our consultants, just 6 of us, a couple of weeks ago, and Claire Bamberg, one of our coaches, said, what are you willing to let go to have everything that you want? And from the moment she asked that question, I have been struggling with it. What am I willing to let go? Are we willing to let go of our old identities to see what God will raise up in this place? I think I'm willing to let go of just about anything, as long as it moves us across the border and into the promised land. Now, what does it look like to lay down an identity? If we have any history buffs here today, when you go home, you are going to want to look up the name Dr. James Barrie. James Barrie was born in Ireland at a year that nobody really knows for sure because he lied on some of his government forms later in life. His mother was fleeing from an abusive marriage, and so she took her children from Ireland and moved them to London, where she had support. And James, at 15 years of age, knew there was one thing he wanted more than anything, and it was to be a doctor. And so his mother got a tutor for him. And the tutor worked with James until they thought he was ready to go to university. And when he applied at university, they turned him down the first time. They said, he's too young. He's so small. He hasn't even gone through puberty yet. He's like a boy among men. We can't let him in. But relatives interceded. And eventually, the university let James Barrie enter. And he studied medicine, and he became a doctor. And he went to work at a hospital in London. But he didn't stop there. He also joined the military. And he was stationed in Canada and Africa and in the UK. And he was so good at what he did that he was made the head of all the military hospitals. You see, James Barrie was an advocate for sanitation, for nutritious food, for clean water, for better living conditions for the patients in the hospitals, and for prisoners. He was campaigning actively for social justice and was successful. He was also honing his skills as an excellent surgeon. He performed one of the first successful cesarean section births in the early 1800s. I cannot imagine being that mom and dad, but they were so excited that it was successful that they named their baby after Dr. James Barrie. Now, when he wasn't working nonstop, living his dream of being a doctor, James Barrie stayed home alone most of the time, preferring his pets to people, especially his dog, Psyche. And he lived a very quiet life, never married, stayed alone when he wasn't at the hospital working. And it wasn't until he died in 1865 that it was discovered that James Barrie was not a man. He was born Margaret Ann Bulkley in Ireland, some unknown date. And somewhere between Ireland and London, with the help of his mother, Margaret became James, because they all knew that a woman would never be permitted to enter the university, and her dream of being a doctor would never come to pass. What did she have to let go? Her identity. She had to let go of her identity to be all that God had created her to be, and she did an incredible job of it. And no one even knew. Let's think about what we have to let go of. We can let go of identity if we're able to. We can let go of traditions that we cherish, just like the Israelites had to let go of the things about Egypt that they loved before they could enter the promised land. We have to be like Aaron and let go of our own life's value to enter into the community bringing the only gift we have, that smoking ashtray, hoping to save lives. So I want to leave you with a question, a couple of questions maybe. First, what kind of church do you want to have? Maybe my view of what this church can be is not your view, and that is okay. I promise you, if you disagree with me, there will be no sinkholes opening up in the sanctuary and you're all suddenly going to disappear. That is not going to happen. And I don't think that any flames are going to shoot off the candelabras and burn anybody up. And I know that no plague is going to go through here. And if it does, I'm going to give the censer to Pastor Jake. I will be hiding under the table. We can disagree, and that is okay, as long as we all have a picture of what can be, as long as we can all let go of something so that we can make room for what God wants to do in this place. And not just in this place, but in your homes, in your families, in your workplace, everywhere. What can you let go of to get everything you want?